hitting the issue on the head. Szacz's articulation of the connection between coercion in Judeo-Christian theology and clinical mental health keenly identifies the potential for toxic theology to negatively impact psychological well-being. A subheading on page 165 is called Biblical Rules Fostering Disability and Illness. He starts the section this way, and I quote, Jewish and Christian religious teachings abound in rules that reward sickness and stupidity, poverty and timidity, in short, disabilities of all sorts. Moreover, these rules or their corollaries threaten penalties for self-reliance and competence, and for pride in health and well-being. End quote. Now, lest his readers get too defensive right off the bat, he does say that he's not arguing that this is the whole essence of the Bible, but he says, and I quote, the religious history of the West illustrates how, by taking one or another part of this work, it is possible to support or oppose a wide variety of human behaviors. End quote. So Szasz isn't trying to make a theological argument here, but simply to draw some connections between the theology and the behavior of persons who profess to be religious and follow the rules of Christianity. He continues, and I quote, the motif that God loves the humble, the meek, the needy, and those who fear him is a thread running through both the Old and New Testaments. Man's fear of being too well off lest he offend God and make him envious is deeply ingrained in the Jewish religion. It is an element common to most primitive religions, that is, religions in which man conceives of God in his own image. God is like man, only more so. The deity is a kind of Superman with his own needs for self-esteem and status, which mortal men are enjoined to threaten at their own peril. This attitude, which is basically a dread of happiness generated by a powerful fear of envy, is fundamental to the psychology of the person seriously committed to the Judeo-Christian ethic. End quote. Szasz is here saying that because the deity of the Judean-Christian religion is man-like, in that he has needs for self-esteem and can be jealous at times, a power differential is created, in which the penitent must submit to the more powerful player in the game, namely God. In order to avoid igniting the fear-inspiring envy of God, the penitent has to take humble and self-effacing actions. Szasz goes on to apply his game-playing theory of mental illness, which I'll explain in more detail later, to the relationship between man and God. He says, and I quote, the power differential between the two players is crucial, for it alone can account for the fear of envy. In a dominant-submissive relationship, only the submissive member of the pair needs to fear arousing the envy of his partner. The dominant player has no such fears, because he knows that the other is powerless to injure him seriously. End quote. So Szasz is here saying that in this dominant-submissive relationship, then, the possibility exists to ignite the envy of the dominant player in the game. As a result, the Judeo-Christian rhetoric instructs religionists to value poverty, timidity, and humility so as to avoid igniting the envy of God. He goes on to compare this to the situation in an oppressive marital relationship, and he says, and I quote, the open acknowledgement of satisfaction is feared only in oppressive situations. For example, by the much-suffering wife married to a domineering husband. The experience and expression of satisfaction, joy, contentment, are inhibited, lest they lead to an augmentation of one's burden. End quote. In other words, don't show yourself to be too happy, contented, or well off in the presence of this dominating player in the game, for fear that they add to your burden, ask you to do more, or dominate you further. It's a bit like at work, when maybe you are laughing and joking with your coworkers, having a good time, and when the boss appears, you immediately pretend to be absorbed in strenuous work. You no longer show yourself to be happy and having a good time, so that you can avoid being given any more tasks for the day. Szasz continues, and I quote, the fear of acknowledging satisfaction is a characteristic feature of slave psychology. The well-worked slave is forced to labor until he is exhausted. To complete his task does not mean that his duties are finished, and that he may rest. On the contrary, it only invites further demands. Conversely, although his task may be unfinished, he might be able to influence his master to stop driving him and to let him rest if he exhibits the appropriate signs of imminent collapse, whether genuine or contrived." End quote. As a result of this power dynamic, then, Szasz says, qualities associated with helplessness become actual advantages. He says, and I quote, "In certain situations, these rules prescribe that when man is healthy, independent, rich, and proud, then God shall be strict with him and punish him. But should man be sick, dependent, poor, and humble, then God shall care for him and protect him." Szasz concludes, "It might seem that I have exaggerated this rule. I do not believe so." End quote. According to Szasz, one of the most famous examples of fostering dependency and disability is in Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. And in a small table on page 170 of The Myth of Mental Illness, he compares a biblical text with its corollary logically in his interpretation. From Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then in the other column, "Man should be poor in spirit." In example, stupid and submissive. "Do not be smart, well-informed, or assertive." And then the beatitude, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." His interpretation, "Man should be meek." In example, passive, weak, submissive. "Do not be self-reliant." The third example he gives, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." His interpretation, "Man should be pure in heart." That is, naive, unquestioning, loyal. Do not entertain doubt. The box is followed by an explanatory paragraph, and I quote, "Stated in this form, it is evident that these rules constitute a simple reversal of rules generally governing rewards and punishment for man on earth. As a result, defects and deficiencies are codified as positive values." End quote. He even mentions Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, which, when seen from this perspective, certainly is a jarring passage. From the New Revised Standard Version, "There are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven." Here, value being placed on being emasculated. As Szasz puts it here, and I quote, "Man's emasculation is here codified as one of the ways of courting God's love." End quote. Szasz then discusses how this theology can make its way into the therapy room when an individual who is unable to care for themselves emotionally and materially and function in a sustainable way in society appears before a psychotherapist, for example. As Szasz puts it, and I quote, "Much of psychoanalytic psychotherapy may revolve around the theme of uncovering exactly who taught the patient to behave in this way and why he accepted such teachings. It may then be discovered that religion, society, and parents have conspired, as it were, to inculcate this code of conduct, even though it is so tragically ill-suited to the requirements of our present social conditions." End quote. This chapter of The Myth of Mental Illness speaks to the potential of toxic theology to impact mental health outcomes. When personal disempowerment is enshrined in sacred verse and connected to an anxious attachment to a God construct, it can be particularly difficult to challenge. Deconstructing these messages, or at least moderating them by way of some sort of theological gymnastics, will be necessary if they are at the root of an individual's inability to cope and contributing to their psychological distress. Thought processes may exist that stymie an individual's recovery, cognitive distortions drawn from unambiguous sacred texts.